Good afternoon. Welcome to today's webinar on the subject of e-Stewards version 4.0. We're going to be providing an overview of the changes between version 3.1 and version 4.0 for clients who are getting ready to transition, as well as for clients who are pursuing initial certification to the standard. My name is Austin Matthews. I'm the EHS Assistant Program Manager with PJR. I have a brief agenda on the screen to give you an idea of what today's presentation will cover. I'll talk a little bit about PJR, who we are, what we do, some of the benefits and drivers for pursuing certification to e-Stewards. I will overview the transition requirements for pre-existing clients, again, clients who are transitioning from version 3.1 to version 4.0. Then I will cover the key changes at a high level, getting into a little bit more detail as to where those changes can be found within the standard with a standard clause by clause type overview. At the end of the presentation, I'll provide an overview of the certification process for clients who are new to PJR or who are pursuing initial certification rather than transitioning. And we'll close with some time for questions. So feel free to type those into the question field at any time, and I will save those for the end. Perry Johnson Registrars is one of the leading registrars in the world. We have certified companies in various countries around the world to a variety of standards. This is not an all-inclusive list of countries in which we have provided certifications, but it certainly gives you an idea of PJR's global presence. We are accredited to grant certification for a wide variety of standards, as I mentioned, including e-Stewards, which we are discussing today. Benefits and drivers specifically related to e-Stewards certification include a commitment to the prevention of irresponsible or illegal handling of hazardous waste or electronic waste streams, data security and protection, social responsibility, and environmental protection and conservation efforts. It also represents a reduction of environmental, occupational health and safety, data security, and social accountability risks by going through the process of implementing and maintaining an e-Stewards certified management system. There are a variety of business management drivers, including improving public image by being able to advertise the e-Stewards certification. The ability to advertise the responsible management of electronics and electronic components is another benefit of certification. The standard may provide a competitive advantage over competitors in the area or who might be bidding for the same contract who do not maintain the e-Steward certification. The standard represents a framework for maintaining compliance with customer and/or regulatory requirements, including the Basel Convention. So a little bit about version 4.0. Version 4.0 of the e-Steward standard was published on February 25th last year. A version of the standard can be downloaded from the e-Stewards website, as well as a copy of the guidance document. The standard is free. Version 4.0 of the standard is free because the proprietary ISO 14001 language has been removed from this version of the standard. as promised, I've included some of the transition information. So the overall deadline for existing version 3.1 certificates to transition to version 4.0 is August 24th, 2021. So this year we've got a couple months left in the transition timeframe. Audits at this point happening after January 1st of this year are automatically being conducted to version 4.0 in order to be able to meet this transition deadline. This is an extension, as originally it was August of last year that we were supposed to start doing the version 4.0 audits. If you have nonconformities during your version 4.0 transition audit, you are still certified to version 3.1 in the interim as long as you can demonstrate conformance to version 4.0 by that overall transition deadline. We can do transition audits either on-site or virtually, provided that the client is a good candidate for virtual auditing techniques. PGR issued its own transition plan after e-Stewards shared the transition information, and that can be found on PGR's website. We recommend a deadline of June 1st of this year for your audit to take place to avoid any lapses in certification. If your audit would typically go in July or August, we recommend conducting it early by June 1st, again, to avoid a lapse. If your audit is held too close to that transition deadline, we may not have enough time to close the corrective actions if you're issued any nonconformities, as well as get all of our in-house certificate decision-making activities completed, such as our technical package reviews. So something to keep in mind if you haven't already scheduled your transition audit for this year, keep this recommended deadline in mind. We can do a transition audit in either a surveillance audit or a recertification audit based on your preference and where you're falling in your certification cycle this year if you're looking to transition. We put some of the transition information into a timeline as a visual representation. Sometimes that's a little bit easier to understand. So at this time, again, we are only auditing to version 4.0. We recommend a deadline of June 1st of this year for your audit to take place in order to prevent a lapse in certification. Any audit dates after June 1st, we do not guarantee no lapse in certification. That potential is there. August 24th of this year is the overall deadline to transition from e-Stewards 3.1 to 4.0, and any remaining version 3.1 certificates on that date will become obsolete. I have included another deadline in this timeline just to keep an eye on it if you've already transitioned or if you're well on your way. The next step in the e-Stewards version 4.0 requirements will be obtaining NAID AAA certification. So this is not due until July 1st of 2022 in order to maintain e-Stewards going forward after that date. However, I do like to point that out as it is new to version 4.0, this requirement. Keep an eye on that deadline as well. It's not required in order to successfully transition to version 4.0, but if you do not obtain NAID AAA certification by July 1st of 2022, you will be suspended or have your e-Stewards certificate withdrawn. We had a question pop up. I just wanted to make sure I wasn't having issues with audio. The list of standards to which we are accredited was not necessarily a complete list. So I would encourage anyone who has questions about what standards we are accredited to check out our website. I work specifically with the EHS program or EHS department for our environmental health and safety and sustainability type standards. So I would not be the best resource for all of the standards we represent. I would direct you to PGR's website for that information. And there's some contact us links on our website as well to get you that answer if it's not clear from our website. I do want to just quickly mention as well that a recording of today's webinar will be made available on PJR's website in the next couple of days, as well as a copy of these slides available for download in case you'd like to reference them later. Okay, so we'll take a look at some of the key changes in version 4.0. Compared to version 3.1, version 4.0 is shorter. This is mainly due to the removal of the ISO 14001 language. You can, again, get a copy of the standard, and it is free from e-Stewards website. Overall, the standard is intended to be easier to understand. Overall, it's to be less prescriptive and more flexible in how some of the requirements are met, but it does maintain rigor in the key areas such as controls for human health, legality of exports, and the security of data. Version 4.0 incorporates the new Basel Convention trade rules and recent amendments. It does require a separate ISO 14001 certification, which is a significant change from version 3.1. You will see in the e-Stewards version 4.0 Appendix C that e-Stewards specifies audit time calculations. So this is not something generated by the certification bodies. This is something that is directed by the standard, how we calculate audit time. Overall, with the changes to Appendix C and the requirement to separate out the ISO 14001 certification, e-Stewards clients can expect an increase in audit time. Again, I mentioned earlier, NAID AAA certification will be required by July 1st of 2022. And it is worth noting as well that e-Stewards clients have a reduced NAID fee that they can take advantage of when you go to pursue that. There is also a guidance document available on the e-Stewards website. I recommend checking the website from time to time to make sure you are using the most current copy. They don't necessarily update everyone that has changed, so I would reference the website to make sure you have the current version. There are an increased number of definitions in this standard, some new terms such as MOCs, materials of concern. We see information about tolling operations, QSCs, qualified smaller components. We'll talk a little bit more about those, but in general, I would recommend reviewing the terms and definitions on your own time. Version 4.0 includes extended producer requirements. There are relaxed inventory requirements for QSCs. You can put them into lots, for example, instead of needing to have a unique identifier on each individual unit for items falling into that QSC definition or category. Version 4.0 allows tolling, although it does regulate it, and adds noise monitoring requirements. In some cases, annual sampling requirements are reduced. The battery testing requirements have been made more flexible in version 4.0. On-site downstream audits have been decreased from a frequency of every 2 years to every 3 years. There are the additions for closure plan requirements, financial instruments, and insurance checks for e-Stewards clients and their downstream processors. And there are now appendices on a variety of subjects in version 4.0, including standard implementation, rules for organizations, rules for certification bodies, and data security requirements, respectively. We will talk a little bit about each of those at the end as time allows. So I mentioned that the 14001 verbiage has been removed. That includes the terms and definitions. Here's a list of some of the terms revised between the two standards. There are a variety of new terms and a couple of removed terms. So again, these slides will be available on PJR's website. Feel free, they're right in the standard as well. Feel free to review these on your own time. If you haven't transitioned yet, I do recommend getting well acquainted with the terminology. I'm not going to go through every clause in the standard. I want to highlight the sections with more significant changes so that we have time to get through all of the slides. Again, in many instances, the standard is shorter because the 14,001 requirements have been removed. If e-Stewards didn't have anything really to add to that requirement or much to add to that requirement, you'll see that section is very short. By requiring a separate 14,001 certification, they have the comfort level of knowing at e-Stewards that you will be meeting those requirements through the 14,001 management system standard. 4.1 covers stewardship management system requirements, and here we see some specified considerations for the scope, things that need to be included and documented in the scope. It does require consideration of the precautionary principle and a couple other items, as well as transparent handling of materials of concern throughout the recycling chain. There are also specified items to be included in the policy, the stewardship policy, which needs to be documented. These include, just as a couple examples, protection from harassment and discrimination, restrictions around materials of concern, transboundary movements and disposal, and restrictions regarding prison operations. Not an all-inclusive list, just a couple examples. You will find those details in section 5.2. 5.3 is shorter with the removal of the 14,001 language, but we do see a new requirement here to establish teams for the implementing and improvement of the stewardship management system, including specifically a safety team, which is to include representation from all levels of the e-Stewards organization. In the risk assessment section, we don't see any changes to the frequency or the scope of the assessments themselves. We do see a requirement to specifically include certain items in the risk assessments, including potentially hazardous processing techniques if you are utilizing them in your facility. .1.2 covers stewardship aspects, specifically requiring consideration of certain items. Again, you can see the full list in 6.1.2. I've listed a couple examples here, like a life cycle perspective, precautionary principle, the waste management hierarchy, significant changes, things like that. We do also here see a requirement for documented information as evidence of both the criteria and the results, and communication as relevant. 6.1.3.1 requires MOCs to be treated as hazardous waste, and e-Stewards organizations need to adhere to the Basel Convention's Article 4A, or the Basel ban, even if their country has not ratified it. This is going to be significant for e-Stewards clients located in the US. 6.1.3.2 houses a brand new section for extended producer responsibility programs. Take a look in the definition for that term if you're not familiar with that to see whether it applies to your organization. If it does, there are specific documented information requirements for those organizations participating in the extended producer responsibility programs, which are required to be made available upon request. 6.1.4 is another new section. It's new to the body of the standard. It's not new to e-Stewards. So this is around or surrounding the performance verification inspections that e-Stewards reserves the right to conduct. This requires a documented plan for the unannounced performance verification program inspections by e-Stewards and specifies inputs or items for inclusion. Just a couple examples here. The full list is in the standard. A commitment to cooperate, assigning primary and backup contacts due to the unannounced nature of these inspections to make sure that someone is always available at the site to help the inspector, allowing the inspector to inspect within 15 minutes of arrival, things like that. 6.1.4.1 covers reporting to the e-Stewards database. It relates to the reporting of all electronic equipment under or through the organization's control to the e-Stewards website. You can find more detail about this requirement in Appendix A. It requires an initial report prior to certification, documenting the period between contracting with a certification body and passing the Stage 1 audit, which is to be at least 3 months, and by January 31st of each subsequent year, where you're reporting on the previous year's data. 6.3 is a new section covering planning for change. This relates to the planning and implementing of appropriate actions regarding significant changes to the stewardship management system. This includes considering requirements for training, communication, monitoring, and documentation. If you are familiar with ISO 45001 at all, this would be similar to the management of change expectations. 6.4 covers contingency planning. It specifies information to be documented and maintained within contingency planning evidence, including the names and contact information for the third party holding the organization's financial instrument, as well as the third party with authority to access the site closure funds. So there are subsections to 6.4, but overall this covers the contingency planning, or the closure plan as many people know it. So no significant changes to the planning for site closure piece. You still need the site inventory descriptions, the closure costs, third-party testing as applicable. There are some changes in 6.4.2 regarding the financial surety. It does remove the option in version 4.0 for a corporate parent to hold the financial instrument. On the flip side, it does allow an exemption from this requirement if the e-Stewards organization can demonstrate that their costs total less than $5,000 US. No significant changes here. A note about internal communication in 7.4.2. There is a note about removing fear of reprisal or addressing that within your system to allow for effective internal communication. This might be in terms of objectives, operational controls, changes, industrial hygiene monitoring results, could cover a variety of things, but the idea is removing the hindrances or issues with effective communication. 7.4.3 covers external communication. It requires communication of relevant controls, emergency response protocols, and security requirements with regards to contractors and visitors. There's specific information that's to be communicated confidentially to upstream customers and the e-Stewards program administrator, and it includes a list within this section in the standard. I've listed a couple examples here. Excuse me. Documented information is shortened overall. There is a change I want to note. You have the ability as the e-Stewards organization in version 4.0 to combine or separate almost any documentation required by the standard if you want to have it in one gigantic manual or each as individual documents. That's up to you. The exceptions are listed here on this slide. There are 3. These 3 documents need to be separated from the rest and maintained individually with easy access to them at all times. You need to maintain a closure plan, an emergency response plan or emergency preparedness and response plan, and a downstream disposition chart. These 3 documents need to be maintained separately individually and separate from the rest of the system. So those are the three exceptions. Seven 7.5.3 covers control of documented information and requires standard required records be maintained for at least 5 years. No significant changes to these sections. There is an annual emergency drill requirement. 8.3 requires prevention of migration of hazards. 8.3.1 kicks in if you are utilizing one or more potentially hazardous processing technology. And these again are defined within the standard. If you are not utilizing any of the processing techniques that fall into this category, you don't have to implement these additional requirements. But if you're utilizing one or more of these techniques, this section applies, and you have to meet all the additional industrial monitoring and industrial hygiene control requirements. There are no significant changes to the intent within 8.4.2. There are some requirements for operational controls of the processing of electronic equipment. Check out Table 2, which talks about restrictions for mechanical processing. There are no changes here except where a closed system is utilized. Overall, this is less prescriptive and not significantly changed. 8.4.3 houses requirements for controls for the electronic equipment, such as packaging, storing, and transportation. You're not allowed to store materials of concern for more than 1 year after receipt, except in extenuating circumstances, in which case evidence is required and the maximum storage is extended to 2 years. The addition of requirements for adequate vehicle and driver safety records for transporters and carrier criteria. There are stacking limits, no more than 2 Gaylords or super sacks. Take a look at section 8.4.3 to see if any of those or the other changes affect your operation. 8.4.4 is a new section covering tolling operations. I mentioned earlier, tolling is allowed but regulated. Here's where you find those requirements. It includes communication expectations, contract stipulations, the annulment of tolling contracts if violations are identified, things like that. Documented information is required as evidence here as well. Prison operations are not permitted unless the organization has obtained written approval from the e-Stewards program administrator and meets specified criteria. There are no changes to the intent of 8.5 regarding reuse and refurbishment of electronic equipment. This section does prohibit the sale or transfer or donation of non-sanitized electronic equipment unless to a NAID AAA certified IDP. There are exceptions to that wordy bullet point, including tolling operations or where non-sanitized electronic equipment is sent back to its original owner. So if something in there might affect your operation, I recommend reviewing it in detail. Refurbishment and or repair can only be outsourced to IDPs, except for ink and toner remanufacturing, which can be outsourced 1 tier beyond the IDP. Direct reuse of electronic equipment must be found fully functional, except shipments to the IDP for refurbishment and or repair. There are no significant changes to the testing requirements in 8.5.1. You can find specific testing requirements here. There are some changes. I mentioned the battery testing criteria, but overall, the section doesn't contain any significant changes. The intent is the same. Table 3 in 8.5.1 constitutes exceptions to the full functionality testing requirements. 8.5.2 specifies identification criteria and inclusions. It simplifies inventory requirements for qualified smaller components. Again, for example, allowing organizations to put them in lots. The minimum amount of information required for shipping documentations is identified in 8.5.2.1, and this needs to be recorded for all sales or transfers. It needs to be made accessible without the need for unpacking the shipment. You can find the declaration for transboundary shipments in Appendix A. If you don't use that exact declaration, you are allowed to use an equivalent, but take a look at the contents of that to make sure what you're using is in fact equivalent. This section also requires accessibility or availability of identifying information for all shipments other than QSCs, such as itemized packing lists or an internet link kept active or kept live, for example. There are a variety of ways to meet these requirements. In terms of verifying direct reuse markets, if there is evidence that shipments were tested fully functional and sold for more than 3 times the scrap rate, the buyer information does not need to be maintained. In 8.6.1, we see specified criteria for managing MOCs with additional references to Appendix A. This section requires written proof or justification for meeting the specified criteria to be provided to the certification body and the e-Stewards program administrator before using a conditionally allowable option. So when we are talking about the restrictions on materials recovery and final disposition, you need approval before you can utilize that option. On the other hand, in 8.6.2, you don't need approval, but you do need to submit. I apologize, I got those mixed up. Okay, so for 8.6.1, you need to submit proof and justification that meets all of the specified criteria in 8.6.1 before using the conditional allowable option. In 8.6.2, when we're talking about alternative uses, not only do you need to submit for approval, you need to submit all of the required documentation and evidence, but you actually need to obtain approval before you can utilize that alternative process. So I apologize if I confused anyone. I flip-flopped the two initially. And these can be found in 8.6.1 and 8.6.2 if you want to take a closer look at those in the standard. 8.7 requires whole electronic equipment to be treated as hazardous electronic waste unless the shipment provides documented evidence proving otherwise. Written notification and competent authority consent is required prior to MOC transboundary movement when countries involved are not Basel Convention parties or covered by relevant multilateral trade agreements. Again, this is going to impact the US. Exemptions from transboundary movement controls for materials of concern are specified in 8.7.1, such as new parts, devices purchased under warranty, cleaned CRT cullet or glass approved as feedstock. There are other exceptions. Those are just a couple examples. Labeling and declaration requirements for transboundary movements in 8.7.2, reference 8.5.2.1 and Appendix A. And this is when electronic equipment or components are being exported to IDPs for refurb or repair. 8.7.3, on the other hand, covers direct reuse transboundary movements. So when electronic equipment is exported for direct reuse, it needs to be fully functional and not recycled or disposed. So it has to have an established resale market, things like that. Again, we see labeling requirements referencing 8.5.2.1 and Appendix A. As far as downstream accountability in 8.8, there's an additional requirement to reevaluate any downstream processor when they have a significant change. So that's twofold. You need a process to be made aware of those significant changes or communicate the need to be made aware of those significant changes, and you need a process to trigger that reevaluation within a timely manner. Even if electronic equipment is directly shipped from the customer to the IDP, it's still required that downstream accountability requirements be met. No significant changes regarding the downstream disposition chart. I do want to note that 8.8.1 specifies an e-Stewards organization cannot utilize any downstream processor within their recycling chain that was e-Stewards certified and lost their e-Stewards certificate in response to a critical nonconformity until their certification is reinstated. Eight point 8.2 covers downstream due diligence. It requires acquiring support documentation and approval of downstream providers and intermediaries within the entire recycling chain, holding them to the same 8.8.2 requirements. So as before, we have initial approval requirements. We have desktop audits, prior to approval and initial shipment, as well as annually thereafter for downstream processors except final disposal facilities. We see on-site audit requirements for IDPs. This is not required if the IDP is e-Stewards certified or if they're a final disposal facility or is an end processor that meets certain criteria. So there are some exceptions to the on-site auditing requirements. And again, as I mentioned earlier, that on-site audit requirement has been relaxed from every 2 years to every 3 years, although it is still required initially prior to initial shipment and approval and upon significant change. There are additions to 8.8.2.3 I mentioned earlier as well that include the review of closure plans and financial surety for the IDP and their recycling chain. Eight point 8.2.4 requires a written contract or agreement or some type of equivalent control with specified information for all HEW and PCM IDPs if they are not e-Stewards certified or a final disposal facility or an end processor that meets certain requirements. Additionally, this section requires each downstream processor after the IDP to implement the same requirements throughout the recycling chain. Annual sampling of shipments between each IDP and the next non-e-Stewards downstream processor are required by 8.8.2.6. 8.9 covers data security requirements. It references Appendix D for organizations not yet certified to NAID AAA certification, which again will be required by July 1st of 2022. After NAID AAA certification is obtained, Appendix D no longer applies, and the NAID AAA certification will satisfy data security requirements for the e-Stewards certification. Meaning after NAID AAA certification is obtained, we won't have to audit the data security requirements anymore. We'll make sure that NAID AAA certification is still maintained and in good standing, and that will be the extent to which we're required to audit data security for version 4.0. No significant changes here, as this is mostly covered in the 14001 language. Facility inspections are unchanged. In 9.1.4, we do see a change to require corrective action if or when the material balance accounting has a final discrepancy of more than 5%. Again, these requirements can be found in 14,001. So really quickly, I want to go through the appendices at a high level. Appendix A covers additional details and criteria for implementing the standard, such as annual e-Stewards database reporting, transboundary shipment declarations, etc. We saw a lot of references to Appendix A throughout the body of the standard as we went through those slides. Appendix B houses administrative criteria for e-Stewards organizations, such as eligibility details, scope of certification, critical nonconformities, logo usage limitations. It requires a new license agreement if the organization is purchased by another company or entity or has some similar change in ownership. Certified organizations are required to notify their certification body and the e-Stewards program administrator of significant changes affecting conformity to the standard within 15 business days. Appendix C houses administrative criteria for the certification bodies such as PJR and accreditation bodies. It specifies audit time calculations in amongst the various requirements in Appendix C. As I mentioned earlier, this is where we are directed to calculate audit time a certain way. Appendix D specifies the data security criteria, such as adherence to applicable regulatory requirements, communication of risks, security processes, methods of sanitization and verification for effectiveness, and controls for security breaches and related incidents. Again, Appendix D applies until NAID AAA certification is obtained. Before we get to questions at the end, I just want to provide an overview of the certification process for anyone who is pursuing certification for the first time. One of the first steps in the process would be to obtain a copy of the standard to get familiar with what the requirements are, to have the verbiage and the terms and the actual requirements accessible to you. You'll need to establish a stewardship management system documentation to meet the various e-Steward standard requirements. You'll need to conduct training to the management system requirements, as well as implement the requirements of the management system and the standard. These include, for example, conducting an internal audit of the system, conducting a compliance evaluation, and conducting a full system review or a management review. This needs to be scheduled after the internal audit, as the internal audit is a required input of the management system review. You'll also need a contract with a certification body such as PJR to conduct your audits. Once contracted and ready to move forward with your audits, you'll have a stage 1 audit and then subsequently a stage 2 audit, which I'll talk about in a moment. You'll need to address any resulting nonconformities before a certificate can be issued. Stage 1 audits evaluate your readiness for stage 2, essentially looking at the documentation framework. They are shorter than a stage 2 audit. The stage 2 audit is a full system audit. We sample all of the shifts, all of the processes to really get a sense of the effectiveness of the implementation of those processes and controls to assess whether the requirements of the e-Steward standard are being effectively met. If any NCRs result from the audit, they need to be resolved before a certificate can be issued. Certificates are good for 3 years. So the subsequent 2 years, you'll be on your surveillance cycle where you have either annual or semi-annual audits based on your preference and contract. These are shorter than stage 2 audits. They're partial system audits to be spot checking, to be sampling, again, ensuring that the A system is maintained as time goes on and the requirements are effectively met. The third year of the cycle, the recertification audit will take place. This is very similar to a stage 2 audit in that it's a full system audit. All shifts, all processes get sampled, and once any nonconformities that are issued are resolved, a new certificate is issued and the cycle starts again. Okay. If you have any questions, feel free to type them into the question field now. I'm going to go to the next slide, which has our contact information on it. In the meantime, in case you want to discuss anything offline, or if you have a really specific or technical question that would be more well suited to an email or a phone call rather than the webinar format. So again, my name is Austin Matthews. I'm the EHS Assistant Program Manager with PJR. I can be contacted via email or the main PJR line. Stacy DeSantis is our EHS Program Manager. She can also be contacted by email or the main PJR number and put through to her extension. I've also included the sales department number on the screen in case you are a new client looking for a quote. They can help you get started with that process. I'm going to leave that up while I check to see if there are any questions. Okay, so I did answer the question earlier about other standards. Again, I would reference our website. I don't see any other questions. I'll hang out for another minute or two in case anyone is typing. If you have your transition audit coming up, I wish you luck. I hope that the presentation today was helpful in preparing for the transition. If you have not already scheduled your transition audit, I highly recommend touching base with your scheduler, as our auditors have limited availability, and we do want to help you avoid a lapse in certification if it can be at all avoided. We have another question. How many companies are registered to this standard? That data I don't have access to. e-Stewards may track that across the various certification bodies. I'm not privy to that detail. PJR has between 9 and 12 e-Stewards clients, I would say. Somewhere around there. Okay. Well, if you don't have any further questions, I'm going to sign off. Thank you for attending today. I hope it was helpful. Good luck with your transition audit, and feel free to reference the recording and a copy of these slides from PGR's website in the next couple of days. Thanks, and have a great day.